To the US now, where the TikTok ban bill has passed the House by a landslide, over 350 votes versus just 65 votes. But the debate got really interesting, with some Republican representatives asking, is this just a Trojan horse? Here's Republican Rep Thomas Massey expressing his concerns.
There's some of us who feel that either intentionally or unintentionally, this legislation to ban TikTok is actually a Trojan horse. Some of us are concerned that there are First Amendment implications here. Americans have the right to view information. We don't need to be protected by the government from information. Some of us just don't want the president picking which apps we can put on our phones or which websites that we can visit. We don't think that's appropriate. We also think it's dangerous to give the president that kind of power, to give him the power to decide what Americans can see on their phones and their computers. To give him that sort of discretion, we also think is dangerous. Now, people say that this TikTok ban will only apply to TikTok or maybe another company that pops up just like TikTok, but the bill is written so broadly that the president could abuse that discretion and include other companies that aren't just social media companies.
Now, if you're of my kind of persuasion, you know that the government never really does anything for our benefit. It does it for its own benefit. So to believe that this kind of bill, this kind of ban is for our safety is, in my humble opinion, beyond naive. Whenever a new bill comes up, I always ask myself, what's the real why behind this bill? And second question, why now? Well, I think Tucker Carlson may have a good idea as to the answer. Today, he tweeted in a classified briefing this afternoon, attended by officials from the Biden Justice Department, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she's a Democrat, claimed that Elon committed, quote, election interference, end quote, in 2022 by changing the algorithms on X to alter the results of the midterms that year. Not coincidentally, the anti-TikTok legislation now being debated on the Hill would allow the federal government to force the sale of any social media platform that interferes in elections. Just so you know what's coming in 2025. Of course, Elon Musk, who basically lives on X, very quickly replied to this tweet saying, actually, I made the algorithm open source and neutral to all parties. But of course, that is election interference by her, Alexandria's, standards. Quite funny. Good one. Now, Joey Marinaro spelt it out even plainer for everyone when he tweeted, they're not voting to ban TikTok. They're voting to ban Rumble and X. They are just saying TikTok. So Republicans go along, read the text of the bill. And when you consider the opinions of Rep Thomas Massey and others, there was a whole cohort who spoke against it, obviously didn't work, got by a landslide anyway, and is likely to in the upper house because it's Democrat ruled and reigned. But it also, I think, makes it even more suspicious that Biden is really kind of ramming this through, saying, oh, we've got to do something about this very quickly in an election year. We've got to get it done now. Well, why now when for years and years and years, TikTok has been the most popular app in America?
There are two issues here. There's the issue of the legislation, which, as you've pointed out, has got hairs all over it.
Oh, yeah.
The other issue is TikTok and its malicious influence on democracy, on the young people of Western nations. So if you could separate for a moment the bad legislation and just go with TikTok, do you agree there is a good argument for TikTok to be banned? Because with America having this argument, now that argument is being felt in Australia. We'll look at Peter Dutton in a moment, but he's calling on Anthony Albanese to do something similar here. So putting aside the bad legislation, do you think TikTok should be banned?
I think, as Thomas Massey said, he had 20 minutes on the floor, which he yielded to some colleagues in part. But there is so many other ways to attack this and achieve the same end without having this kind of sloppy, altogether sweeping legislation.
Sure, but
He
you think...
also raised points like Facebook, Instagram are going to benefit from this massively. Do we really want them having more power?
The difference here is that TikTok is controlled by China with relations to the Chinese Communist Party. Right. So I would argue it's in a unique situation other than, say, Facebook or Instagram.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the legislation is bad. I don't think there's much question about that. The way it has been written, if you were to believe what they say about it, it is clearly wrong and bad. As for whether
it's deliberate.
I know it's deliberate. But as for TikTok itself, TikTok ought to be banned. I mean, the symbiosis between Chinese businesses and the Chinese Communist Party is completely different to any other part of the world. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party can literally ask a Chinese business to do anything it wants it to do, and if you don't comply with that, it's over the neck for you. So the difference between a Facebook and a TikTok is stark, and we showed a clip, and I know Paul talked about this in his editorial at the top of his show tonight as well. We showed a clip last week from 60 Minutes in the US where they explained the differences between the Chinese version of TikTok and the Western version of TikTok. On the Chinese version of TikTok, kids are getting content about how to do science experiments and mathematics. They're restricted how long they're able to use it. It's being used to pump up their kids for academic purposes, whereas kids who scroll along on TikTok in Australia or the US or the UK are just being fed absolute garbage that rots their brains, and that is not a coincidence either. So yes, I agree that TikTok in some form ought to be banned. This is just not the way to do it. TikTok, as you say, is the Trojan horse.
Exactly, and it always sets up this question of who gets to be the arbiter of what is allowed and what's not allowed. And this bill sets that arbiter up to be the President of the United States of America. That's just wrong. You do not get to decide what Americans can and can't see. The fact that this is a Trojan horse, I think, is very obvious. As Thomas Massey said in another part of his speech, he said if this is just about banning ByteDance and forcing them to divest their US assets within 6 months of the passing of this bill, why is it 13 pages long? Because there's all sorts of clauses in there that quite obviously don't necessarily apply, but would apply to other social media websites like Rumble, like X, that are very influential and which conservatives and other groups, which have been made very unwelcome on other platforms, have flocked to.
So that's the argument in the US. Let's have a listen to Peter Dutton, who's calling on Anthony Albanese to consider whether TikTok should be banned here, and hopefully if they do, they'll get the legislation right.
If data is being scraped by the terabytes off these accounts and young people are being exposed to extortion at some point or just their personal data being collected, if it's not a safe platform, the Prime Minister has a responsibility to act. And so far, I just don't think he's shown the leadership or the strength of leadership to be able to make the decision that's in our country's best interest.
Now, it was reported today that Anthony Albanese had responded there were no plans in Australia to ban TikTok, and TikTok immediately put out a statement saying thank you to the Australian Prime Minister. I find it hard to believe that Albanese wouldn't be considering it, bearing in mind, as Peter Dutton pointed out, there's major security issues. China, despite our trade relationship with them, are not a friend, they're an adversary. The harm to young people is well known, but also what may not be so well known is the Chinese Foreign Minister is visiting Australia next week. So it's probably not great timing for Anthony Albanese to be talking about the dangers of TikTok with that visit about to happen. Plus, we've just had our trade relationship with China improved as they take our wine. Does Albanese really believe TikTok is neutral and benign, or is he just really being very careful what he says in light of our relationship and what happened to the Morrison government when they dared to point out the nefarious nature of the Chinese Communist Party?
Of course. I mean, Albanese is as limp as a wet lettuce leaf when it comes to China. We saw that in his trip to China after going and meeting Xi Jinping and being called a handsome boy, was asked at a press conference, what did you talk about? What did you achieve? And he went on for half an hour about, we talked about whether or not all pandas are cute and all this sort of stuff. He treats China with kid gloves. I don't think he would seriously consider a ban on TikTok because he knows the can of worms that would open up. And it's a can of worms that ought to be opened, but it's not a can of worms that the Prime Minister wants to open because he's trying to make friends with China. We'll get a bit more on that later.